All right, I'm interviewing with Miss Nitza. Lagh. I just wanted to pronounce it correctly. And our first question is, how would you define dual language learners or English language learners, specifically in the classroom?
So that's a great question. We like to use the term dual language learners
Okay.
because it really reflects the power of the fact that they're learning two languages, sometimes more than two languages at the same time. And so, usually, specifically for the youngest children, like let's say birth to 8, we like to use the term dual language learners to reflect that. In schools, once you get to kindergarten, they use the term English learners, and it's really more of an eligibility category,
Okay.
defining children who qualify to receive ESL services. So there's a little bit of a distinction.
Okay.
But again, from a perspective of the theory and the research, we really would prefer to use the term DLL.
Okay. All right, so our next question is, what are some things to remember when inviting ELL students into a new setting or environment in the classroom?
So I think that let's talk about children first, and then we'll
Okay.
talk about families. So I think about children. Um, Oftentimes, when a DLL comes into the classroom, it's the first time they're coming into contact with English,
Okay.
and so a lot of times, let's talk about preschool or pre-K. They're coming into the classroom. They've really never had any formal experience with English. All of a sudden, a lot of the language that they had up until yesterday that was very valuable because it got them around and to navigate places and to interact with people is no longer working because now
Okay.
the prevailing language is English. So I think one of the things to take into account is to realize that and to find ways that you can bridge that huge transition between coming from your home language and culture into a new setting where there's a new language and
Okay.
oftentimes a different culture. So not only are they navigating a language, also a culture. The way they use that language is different,
It's different.
because the expectations are different. So for children, that is the primary thing to take into account. For families, the same is true. Obviously, they might not speak the language, but also I think one needs to be aware that a lot of the families are not familiar with the systems and procedures and expectations that we have in place here. So even thinking of themselves as partners is not something that is prevailing.
Okay.
A lot of the cultures from which families of DLLs come from are really very deferent to a teacher or to a figure of authority like a doctor or a social worker or a principal. And so they don't view themselves as partners. They really view themselves as, I'm here to do what you tell me. And oftentimes
working
we have
together.
different expectations. We have the expectation that they're doing their part and that they're coming to the table to as our equal. And so when we have different expectations than the family, then there's likely to be some level, if not conflict, at least maybe sometimes disappointment, or sometimes there could be other, let's say, miscommunication. So having the clear recognition that not everybody needs to be necessarily on the same page, and then finding out how to get on the same page becomes very crucial.
Okay, so I know this isn't one of my questions, but it's a question I have now.
Sure.
When you say expectations, have you ever had a situation from your own personal experience where the parent felt like they couldn't meet your academic expectation for the child? Is there a cultural,
Yeah, so a lot of families, for example, have the mindset that their job is to have their child behaving well,
Okay.
not interrupting, not bothering the other children. Their job is to prepare the child to do what the teacher says, but they may not necessarily see themselves as a child's teacher in that when they're supposed to be working on the academic piece.
Okay.
And so that's one of those places where I feel it's very critical to bring in that parent as a partner and lay out the expectations of what the role is. In this country, in this culture, in this society, this is how we work. And so parents need to develop their role in this way, and we are hoping that you can come in the classroom and participate. That may not be what they're used to from their country of origin, so that creates a little bit of a it could potentially create in the teacher this feeling of this parent's not interested. They're not doing their job. They're not doing what they're supposed to do. They don't care about their child. When in reality, it's none of the above. It's really that they don't see themselves as having to do that.
Okay.
So,
Thank you.
Sure.
I like that answer very much.
It's a very strange house because there's a lot of stuff that has been going on language-wise forever. So I was born in Cuba, and my whole family is Cuban, and we obviously spoke Spanish. And then when I was 5 years old, we left Cuba and moved to Miami, Florida, as a part of a major group of people who were leaving all at the same time back in the 60s. And then I became an EL or a DLL in a school in Miami, and at that time there was no such thing as ESOL or any of that. I mean, it was just like you're sitting in the classroom and you hoped for a good teacher who would somewhat have some sympathy for you. And I mean, this has been many eons ago, so I don't really have many memories other than I know I had a very nice teacher who took the time to come to my house and meet my parents and and get involved. Yep.
Okay.
And learn more about us and all of that. My children, well, I should finish up me. I then left in second grade and moved to Colombia, South America, where for 1 or 2 years my schooling was all in Spanish. So it went from all Spanish to all English, now back to all Spanish. And then in fourth grade, we moved to a different city in Colombia where there was a bilingual school. And so from fourth grade on to graduating from high school, I attended a bilingual school. So I had both languages, even though, of course, the language of the environment was Spanish. So that was very fortunate for me. My husband was born in Germany and lived in Germany his whole life and came to Penn State for a 10-week exchange and met me, and then after graduating we got married and he came over. He had learned English some because over in Europe it's very common for everybody to learn English, and so we could communicate, but he still spoke with a heavy accent. It has improved over the last 40 years, but so a lot of the issues or challenges centered around idioms and expressions that we use. That when you learn a language formally, you don't learn necessarily all these expressions of how we talk in the day to day. My children were born here and were exposed to German and Spanish at home, and what's interesting about that is that my children correct me and my husband. Yes, because we both have an accent. So they'll pick on words and they'll say, but mostly now that they're almost 25 years old, it's more of a game, in the sense of making fun. There's some certain words that I know I pronounce, and it's not quite the way you would pronounce them, but so it's kind of funny. Going back to what the challenges are, I think one of the challenges is that, there are sounds in languages that are not part of another language. And so, for example, in Spanish, we have this very hard R, like the word, the name rose is pronounced rosa. And so, or if I want to say a race would be carrera. And so I know that that's a very troublesome sound for English speakers to pronounce. So if I were to ask you to pronounce that, you would probably not be able to pronounce it, because that's one of those sounds that as a little child, you're not exposed to, so you don't hear it, you don't say it. So the same way that you can't say it, there's some sounds in Spanish or in English that are hard for dual language learners to pick up. Because they don't exist. And the same happens, for example, in Mandarin. There are certain sounds, like, again, R's are very troublesome. So people who are Chinese tend to replace them with an L. And so these are just things that are challenging. I would say there's sounds that are challenging. Sometimes there's structures of sentences that are challenging. And when you even get older, then there's idioms and expressions that they're different in the different languages. Last but not least, I'd say that the way we use language is probably different across cultures as well. So while certain things may be appropriate in certain cultures and in others, language and culture go really together. Hand in hand. And so that's another challenge. So you got a few different challenging pieces there.
Do you catch yourself doing code switching, kind of when you're?
I do that all the time.
Really?
Oh, of course. I mean, that, you know what? That is something that is that's a part of being bilingual, and it is not, contrary to what a lot of people think, it is not a sign of a weakness or anything like that. It's just a very natural feeling. I'll tell you one thing is that there's a new term
Okay.
in this world now that has gone beyond code stitching. It's called translanguaging. And what this word is about is that a bilingual or a potential or emergent bilingual should have access to all of the language resources in their brain.
Okay.
So in the old days, one used to think that each language had a part of the brain. So the Spanish was housed here and the English here, whatever. But we know now from research that that's not true.
Yes.
These languages are interacting in the brain. And so the way that's being expressed is exactly that. So if I know that you speak Spanish and English, why should I restrict myself to just speaking in English when I can
Or
appeal
just
to
speaking
Spanish?
Spanish when I can do both.
Yes. And the other thing is languages are encoded, setting related. So for example, my level of, let's say, expertise or fluidity in English when it comes to professional terms is potentially a bit higher than it is in Spanish, because I didn't work in a Spanish setting ever. So all the vocabulary that has to do, let's say, with what we do
Okay.
is encoded in my brain in English. There are other parts of my brain that are very strong in Spanish because that's where that was encoded. So there could be maybe, let's say, discussions around dance or other things that I may have learned while I was living in Colombia that are stronger in Spanish than they are in English. So there's all of this stuff happening in a bilingual brain, and translanguaging is a really nice term to describe all that, not only as a phenomenon but also as a pedagogical method, because we're trying to say that the ideal setting for a DLL is one in which all of this can happen and be reinforced. So that's like the optimum thing we would like to have DLLs experience.
So, based off of some of the challenges that you were saying, and even with the language, would you suggest any research-based strategies that would help with those challenges? That because if you're facing them, then it's probably a lot of people who
Yeah.
probably are facing the same.
So I mean, in the classroom, I think, for talking about back to little kids
Yes.
now, young children, I think a lot of the strategies that we are thinking are effective with DLLs are, number one, really supporting their home language.
Okay.
So trying to bring that in and integrating it in the classroom throughout the day, even when teachers don't speak the language. And of course, the big question is like, wow, how am I going to do that if I don't speak that? Well, there's a lot of ways that a teacher can make a little bit of an effort,
Yes,
and
that's
find
true.
out how do you pronounce these different things? Sending something to the homes beforehand and getting the parents to help out. Sending a recorder to the home and having the mother or the dad or the older brother or somebody say the words, pronounce the words, so that the teacher can learn them that way. So
Okay.
there's a lot of different things. Reading the book in the home language first before you read it in English.
I love that
having
idea.
someone from the community come and read the book to the children who are Spanish speakers or Arabic speakers, so that by the time then the child hears the book in English, they already know the story. And so once you comprehend the story in your own language, it's a lot easier to
Easier.
attach the English labels onto things. So if I know a story, let's say Harry the Dirty Dog.
Okay.
And I know what happened to Harry. I know that Harry, got out and he went around town and he got really
so
dirty,
dirty.
So if I know all that, then as I'm listening to the story in English, I start to pair up the
Kinda make those
words and like,
connections.
oh, dirty, that's sucio in Spanish. I get it, and that's how you learn a new language. And so a lot of modeling, a lot of gesturing, a lot of using props. So for example, if you're going to have children be dismissed to centers, and you're introducing the centers instead of just talking about in the arts center today we have this and that. You might want to bring the thing that's new in the arts center.
Okay.
And as you're talking, then have it in your hand so that you can refer to it, show it, and that way even if the child doesn't know the words for it, they know what you're talking about.
They've seen the
so
image before.
all of those, and there's many other strategies, but those are just a couple of things that you can do to reinforce the language learning, being very intentional. So using a lot of our read right from the start strategies
Yes.
with just like an additional layer that relates to the use of home language and integrating that in there.
Well, thank you so much
You're
for meeting
welcome.
with me today.
You're welcome.
And I will actually send you the final product.
When I'm done.